This page, J29. So now that we've given you some background as far as digestion, now let's talk about that second process that occurs in the alimentary canal, and that's the absorption of nutrients. We know that whereas most digestion occurs in our duodenum, most of the actual absorption of these nutrients, monosaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, and so on, nucleotides, occurs across the jejunum and ileum. Don't worry about these active transport mechanisms. That's a subject you'll get into in physiology. But what I do want to remind you of, that we talked about previously, is that in the villi of the intestine, the small intestine, in the lamina propria area, this area right in the middle, there are both blood capillaries and lymphatic vessels called lacteals. And we had mentioned that the most nutrients are going to be absorbed into the bloodstream, into the blood capillaries. However, fats are going to be absorbed into these lacteals, these lymphatic vessels. At the bottom of the page, so that's exactly what we wrote. We wrote at the bottom that water-soluble nutrients, they're going to be absorbed into those blood capillaries and carried in a blood vessel called the hepatic portal vein right to the liver. We're going to show you a picture of that, but just before we do, what do we mean by water-soluble nutrients? Any nutrient that is not a fat is water-soluble, meaning it will dissolve in water. Now we know fats will not dissolve in water. If you have vegetable oil and you mix it with water, we know the vegetable oil separates and floats right on top of water. So fats and oils will not dissolve in water. Anything that's not a fat will generally dissolve in water. Will sugars dissolve in water? Of course sugars will dissolve in water. You put sugars in, stir it up, it dissolves. Will salt dissolve in water? Yes. But incidentally, if you were to pour sugar in vegetable oil, it doesn't dissolve. It just kind of floats there, but it won't dissolve. So anything that's not a fat, an amino acid, a sugar, nucleotide, they are water-soluble. So let's see a picture of how they are, these water-soluble nutrients are going to be absorbed into these blood capillaries, and then they are carried through the bloodstream. Look on the next page, or actually J31. And on J31 on this picture, so on this picture, the blood vessels from the digestive tract, from the small intestine, as well as from the stomach, as well as even from the large intestine, all these water-soluble nutrients that are being absorbed into the bloodstream are carried in this vessel called the hepatic portal vein directly to the liver. And for the moment, we'll simply say the reason why it's called hepatic portal vein. Hepatic means liver. That's where it's being carried to. Portal because it's being transported right to the liver. And why the liver? So we wrote here that the liver, which is the largest organ in the body, if you don't count the skin, is a major center for processing and storing nutrients. So the vast majority of nutrients that are absorbed from our digestive tract are stored in our liver. That's where nutrients are stored. I have a video covering the liver and gallbladder and pancreas. If you've watched it, you saw how sugars are stored in our liver as glycogen. Vitamins and minerals are stored in our liver. So this is the major center where nutrients absorbed from the digestive tract are carried, and then they're going to be processed and stored in the liver. Incidentally, since we're looking at this picture, I just want to show you that, interestingly, there's two blood vessels shown carrying blood to the liver. There's a hepatic artery shown right here that's bringing oxygenated blood to the liver, and I talk about this on the video on the liver. And there's the hepatic portal vein that's bringing blood not high in oxygen, but high in nutrients that have been absorbed from the digestive tract to the liver. And then we can see that there's a blood vessel that carries blood out of the liver called the hepatic vein. And so that's where the blood leaves the liver, through the hepatic vein. So we're going to talk more about circulation today, but I'm just drawing your attention to that. Now, if we've just described how the water-soluble nutrients are absorbed into the bloodstream and carried to the liver. What about the lipid-soluble nutrients? What about the fats? And by fats, we mean fatty acids, cholesterol. If you've had a nutrition class, fat-soluble vitamins, such as vitamins A, D, E, and K, fat-soluble. All of these are absorbed into these lymphatic vessels called lacteals. And they are going to actually they're going to travel through these lymphatic vessels which connect to the general bloodstream. And eventually they will be transported to the liver. Exactly how that works, we will describe when we get to the lymphatic system in section P. That's when we'll learn how the lymphatic system of vessels connects up to our blood vessels. Because there's two sets of vessels in our body, blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, and they interconnect up in the subclavian veins in our shoulders, but we'll learn about that. Okay, what we've listed next is some disorders associated with the small intestine, just as we've talked about disorders of the stomach. What's a duodenal ulcer? Ulcer is a sore. It's in the duodenum. What causes it? The same thing that causes a gastric ulcer, a bacterial infection. It's technically a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori. I'm not asking you to know it, but for those of you who have to take micro, you may as well learn it now, because for sure they're going to ask you to know it's in micro. But anyhow, we'll just say it's a bacterial infection. What is enteritis? Itis means inflammation, an inflammation or infection. Entero means intestine. So a generic term for any kind of inflammation or infection of the intestine is called enteritis. Incidentally, what do we call the doctors that specialize in stomach and intestinal problems? Gastroenterologists. You ever heard that term? Gastro means stomach, entero means intestine. You know, one of the challenges that an average layperson has is when they're ill, they don't even know the difference between all these different doctors. They don't know the difference between a cardiologist, a nephrologist, a pulmonologist, a gastroenterologist, a ear, nose, and throat doctor, an otolaryngologist. You know, that's the challenge that they have, a urologist. So they don't even know which doctor to go to. But gastroenterology is the study of stomachs and intestines. On J32, we come to the large intestine. The large intestine, also known as the colon. Now, the large intestine we wrote is a 4-foot-long tube. I'll remind you that I'm never going to test you on the length of a tube. I only mention it just so you have a reference point. But here's a question. If the large intestine is 4 feet long, and we had said that our small intestine was 20 feet long, then why is the large intestine called the large one? Because it's wider. Yeah, it's wider in diameter. So it's not that it's longer, it's actually shorter, but it is wider in diameter. And it extends, we wrote, from the Ileo-Cecal Sphincter to the anus. And we'll remind you what the Ileo-Cecal Sphincter is. Now, as far as the subdivisions of the large intestine, so we divide that large intestine into what's called the cecum, the ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anus. And we can see these here. Let's just look at this picture. This picture, you'll notice where the ileum of the small intestine is connecting to the large intestine. And there is a valve or sphincter right here that controls the flow of chyme from the ileum into this area right here. This is called the cecum, this area right here. It's interesting that you'll notice the small intestine doesn't attach to the bottom of the large intestine. It actually attaches a couple of inches above where the large intestine begins. Here's where it begins, but it actually attaches a little bit above it. But this area right here is called the cecum. Attached to the cecum is the appendix, which we'll speak about in a moment. That's an organ of the immune system. Remember what the sphincters or valves are for. Very good, one-way flow. They allow what's in the ileum to go into the large intestine but prevent it from flowing backwards. Now, this picture shows the different parts of the colon, but I think the picture that shows it even better is back around J1. So if we go back to J1, and the page just before J1 was this big picture of the entire digestive system. And if we look right here, I think this shows it best. So you'll notice right here, here's the ileum of the small intestine. And it's connecting right here to the cecum. And there's a sphincter called the Ileo-Cecal Sphincter. Notice how the appendix is attached to the bottom of the cecum. And follow the arrows. So the chyme, as it were, is pushed up from the cecum upwards through what's called the ascending colon. Ascending means to go up. And then you'll notice it bends right here below the liver. And right where it bends is called the hepatic or right colic flexure. A flexure is a bend. It's called hepatic because it's right below the liver, and the liver, of course, is on the right side of your abdomen. And then, following the arrows, it then flows horizontally through what is called the transverse colon. And there's the word, and that makes sense because we learned the word transverse means horizontal. We learned about a transverse process of a vertebra that goes horizontally. We learned about the inner layer of abdominal muscle called the transversus abdominis, where the muscle fibers run horizontally. If we learn what these words mean, it helps us. And then the large intestine bends right here. And while it's not shown, your spleen is located right here on the upper left side of the abdomen. So this is called the splenic or left colic flexure, right where it bends downwards. And then it flows downwards through what's called the descending colon, descending meaning to go down. And then it kind of bends like a letter S or like a snake. And that's called the sigmoid colon. Sigmoid means like a snake, like an S shape. And then finally we come to the rectum, the very end of the large intestine, and then it opens as the anus. So those are the parts of the large intestine. Back on J32, these were listed in order. And what I'd like to remind you of is you are responsible for knowing the order in which food moves through the entire alimentary canal. And that's the exact order that I've been talking about these topics. So, of course, we began with the oral cavity. It goes from the oral cavity through the oral pharynx, laryngopharynx, esophagus, stomach, duodenum, jejunum, ileum, into the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, the rectum, and the anus. So yes, you need to know the order. If you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be a nurse practitioner, a physician's assistant, you're going to be dealing with patients who have problems along the length of their alimentary canal. If you need to know the difference between a jejunum and a descending colon, and the difference between an esophagus and a laryngopharynx. Okay, these are the parts of the human body. All right, well, what we wrote next is that the large intestine, the wall of the large intestine exhibits sacculations called Haustra. And we might say, what does that mean? So you'll notice that on our picture, on this J32, you can see that the large intestine is kind of sacculated into what are called Haustra. In other words, it doesn't have a smooth outer surface. So in other words, if this is the appearance of the small intestine, it's kind of smooth on the outer surface, the large intestine, which is wider in diameter, that's why it's called large, is sacculated. And these sacculations are called Haustra. We can see this very nicely on J36. So if we look on J36, on J36 at the top left, what we're looking at is an X-ray of the large intestine. And the way we know that X-rays normally permit us only to see hard, dense structures like bones and teeth. But if we inject dyes into structures of our body, if we inject dyes into blood vessels, if we inject dyes into the stomach, then we're able to see these soft structures using an X-ray. So when they inject a dye into a blood vessel, that's called an angiogram. In this case, barium, which is kind of a metal, it's in column 2 on the periodic chart, right by calcium. So they've introduced barium, this metal, into the large intestine and taken an X-ray. Now, how did they get the barium there? Well, if they wanted to look at the stomach or small intestine, they'd probably just have you swallow this barium, and then it would coat the stomach and small intestine, and they could take an X-ray and then see the stomach and small intestine on the X-ray. But if they want to look at the large intestine, if they have you drink it, they're going to have to wait a day. Remember, it takes 1 to 2 days, 24 to 48 hours, for food to move from your mouth all the way to the anus. So they don't want to wait a day. So they're actually going to introduce it using an enema through the anus. So it's introduced from the anus, and then introduced, and it goes up the large intestine. And so now this barium is here, and we can clearly see these Haustra, or sacculations. Now, this is known as a lower GI X-ray. They'll do a lower GI series. And what they did is, after they took this X-ray, they had the person go to the bathroom. So then they pooped out the barium, and then they took another X-ray, and you can see, because there's very little barium left, it's not showing up very well. So without that barium in the large intestine, you can't see it with an X-ray. That's what allows you to visualize it. Okay, well, back where we were on J32, what are the functions of the large intestine on the bottom of J32? The large intestine stores a lot of water. A lot of water is stored in the large intestine. And on J33, of course, in addition to water, there are all these food residues that are in the large intestine. Now, we might ask, what do we mean by food residues? We've mentioned this before back on J2. A food residue is whatever we were not able to digest or absorb. If you swallow gum, if you swallow a penny, we can't digest or absorb a gum or a penny, so it's just going to end up in the large intestine. But most of us are not swallowing gum or pennies most of the time, but something that we all swallow is cellulose. Cellulose, of course, is the complex polysaccharide that makes up the outer cell wall of a plant cell, and we cannot digest it or absorb it. It's known as fiber or roughage. And so all of this cellulose that's in foods that we ate from plants, vegetables, fruits, and grains, all contain varying amounts of cellulose that we cannot digest, and that acts as food residues in our large intestine. Now, there are a lot of bacteria that are in the large intestine. And our first thought is, how'd they get there? Didn't the hydrochloric acid kill all the bacteria? Didn't all those digestive enzymes destroy all the bacteria? And the answer is, obviously no. You learn in micro, there are bacteria that can survive almost anything when they go into what's called an endospore form. So there are bacteria that have survived the entire passage through the stomach and the small intestine, and they start to multiply in the large intestine where there's all these food residues. And they start to digest what we were not able to digest. Now, most of the time, many of these bacteria don't really bother us at all. Some of them can cause problems, and some of them are actually considered good guys. Because as they digest the part of the food that we're not able to digest, they actually make more vitamins and minerals, more nutrients available to us. In a nutrition class, one learns that the bacteria, the good bacteria in our large intestine, by breaking down food residues there, make available something called vitamin K, a very important vitamin for blood clotting. So that's made available by good bacteria digesting the food residues that we were not able to digest. I might also make mention that as the bacteria break down the food residues in the large intestine, they generate gases. And this is the major source of flatulence, or gases, that come out the other end, the anus. So the major source of these gases, or flatulence, is bacterial digestion of food residues in the large intestine. That's their major source. Now, one of the notable bacteria that's in our large intestine is called E. coli. E is short for Escherichia coli. It's called coli because it lives in the colon, the large intestine. Now, most of the time the bacteria doesn't cause problems, but it can cause problems. It can. And this bacteria, for example, is in the feces of the large intestine. And of course, it also comes out in our feces or stool when one has a bowel movement. Because there is this bacteria in the feces, it is the most common cause of urinary tract infections in women. And without getting overly graphic, at least right now, later I will get more graphic when we get to the urinary and reproductive system, but it really comes down to, in women, a wiping issue. Because the urethral canal is towards the front side of the pelvic area. Obviously, the anus is the back. And one's supposed to wipe backwards, not forward. If one wipes forward, then some part of the fecal matter containing E. coli may be introduced around the opening where urine comes out. And that's the most common cause of a urinary tract infection. It's caused by E. coli bacteria. You might ask, well, don't men have this same issue? And in men, it's a little bit different, as we'll learn later, because the penis of a guy is kind of sticking out in the front, and it's kind of dangling out there kind of away, so the wiping issue is not such an issue. There's also a difference in the length of what's called the urethral canal that we'll talk about later. Men have a long urethral canal in the penis, and women have a very short urethral canal. So urinary tract infections are quite common in women. They're very rare in men. We'll have more to say about that. One more comment I want to make about E. coli is that since E. coli is found only in the large intestine of humans and other animals, it's also found in the large intestine of all other animals, dogs, cats, elephants, mice, whatever, and it's found in the feces, the health department actually can test for E. coli, and if they see E. coli bacteria anywhere, they know there's fecal matter there, because that's how it got there, because this bacteria is only found in the large intestine of an organism or in the feces. So when the health department inspectors check restaurants, right, we know they give them a letter grade, and one of the things they want to know is, are there any mice or rats hanging out in that restaurant? Now, of course, what causes mice and rats to hang out at restaurants or markets or anywhere else is where there's food. So does the health inspector actually have to, now let me just say, mice and rats don't come out in the middle of the day. You know, when customers are out there in the restaurants, they come out at night when there's nobody around. So does the health inspector have to show up at 2 in the morning with a flashlight to see if there's mice or rats crawling around? No, they don't. All they have to do is they take a swab and they swab the surfaces of the tables and the floors and the countertops, and they do a culture. They culture that swab and they see, are there any E. coli bacteria that they could detect on the countertops, on the floors, and other surfaces. If there are E. coli bacteria, that means you've got mice or rats coming out in the middle of the night, taking a little poop or here or there, and there's E. coli all over the place. So they're not going to get a letter A score because it means they're not putting the food away, they're leaving food out, they're not keeping it clean, and that's attracting mice and rats to that site. This is also, I'll mention parenthetically, what the environmental inspectors do in Santa Monica Bay. You may have heard that after a rainstorm, what happens with rainstorms is, you know how when it rains, the streets are all clean? That's because all the junk that was along the curbs is washed by the rain down the storm drains and carried directly into the Santa Monica Bay through our storm drain system, flood control canals. And it goes directly into the Santa Monica Bay. That includes dog poop and cat poop and everything else. So that goes directly into the Santa Monica Bay. What they do is they test the ocean water, and they will find that there's a high, what they call coliform count, a high E. coli count. And that's not because any surfer or person was out there and happened to go to the bathroom. That's because of the dog poop and stuff that's been washed from the streets and curbs right down into the Santa Monica Bay. And they will warn surfers not to go out and surf on those days following a rainstorm. Usually, those are the only times where we get all this dog poop washed out into the Santa Monica Bay, and that creates a high E. coli count. And so they use E. coli as a marker for whether there's fecal matter environmentally or in terms of public health. So it's a very important bacteria to know something about. Okay, the appendix is about a 3.5-inch long structure, sometimes nicknamed the tonsil of the abdomen. Here's an enlarged picture, the ileum attached to the cecum of the large intestine. Here's this vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm-like, looks kind of worm-like. Now, the reason why it's nicknamed the tonsil of the abdomen is because like tonsils, like our pharyngeal tonsil and palatine tonsil palatine tonsil, pharyngeal tonsil, and lingual tonsils that we've spoken of, the appendix also similarly is made up of or contains lymphocyte white blood cells and macrophages. And again, I see, so this is an organ of the immune system, and I see this strategically located. We had seen that previously the palatine and lingual tonsil were located around our back of our mouth, because that's an entry point for bad guys. The pharyngeal tonsil was located on the back wall of the nasopharynx, because another entry point is through our nose, so that's where another tonsil is located. We've just told you that the large intestine is loaded with bacteria, breaking down food residues there. So wouldn't it be appropriate to have another organ of the immune system with a lot of white blood cells, just think of like a military squad just waiting there, just in case any of these bacteria act up. So you've got all these white blood cells and macrophages waiting for them. So I see it strategically located. Now, as far as disorders associated with the appendix, just like the tonsils can become inflamed, infected, and enlarged, that's called tonsillitis, the appendix can become infected, inflamed, and enlarged, and that's called appendicitis. Now, while doctors are reluctant to remove the tonsils today, sometimes they have no choice, they have to, but they're reluctant to. If somebody does have appendicitis, they will almost always surgically remove it, and that's called an appendectomy. And I remind you that it's located in the right lower quadrant. I don't know why I wrote quadrants, but quadrant. That's where the pain's going to be. Now, why do they always remove it if it's part of our immune system? And the answer is because failure to not remove it, it could result in rupturing of the appendix. And if this appendix ruptures, that means fecal matter with bacteria will spill out of the appendix into the abdominal cavity. And now we've got fecal matter with bacteria spilling out into the abdominal cavity. That's going to cause a widespread infection in the abdomen called peritonitis, because after all, we know another name for abdomen or abdominal is peritoneal. You'd say, when did we learn that? Page A3. A3, we wrote that. So that causes peritonitis. And furthermore, these bacteria can then enter the bloodstream. From the abdomen, they can enter the bloodstream. And you'll learn in microbiology that when bacteria enter the bloodstream, that's called septicemia. I'm not asking you to know that word, but septicemia, that becomes life-threatening. That's very serious. People can die from that when we've got massive amounts of bacteria entering the bloodstream. So the risk of not removing the appendix and having it possibly burst, rupture, and spill fecal matter with bacteria into the abdomen isn't worth the risk. So that they see that somebody has an enlarged appendix, they will surgically remove the appendix, and they sew it off right here, and then it's done. Another interesting point is that there is a statistical cohort as to when people commonly get appendicitis and have their appendix removed, and that's in the early teens to late teens. That's the most common time, from around the age 11, 10 or 11, to about the age of 18. So while there are people who have their appendix removed at other ages, the most common age where the appendix gets inflamed and needs to be removed is from around age 11 to 18. So whether you or you know of somebody that's happened, it's probably been in that age range. Why is it? I don't know, but we know the body changes shape during puberty, and perhaps it just has to do with the change in shape that causes this increased risk of inflammation of the appendix at that time. The anal canal is the name for the last segment of the alimentary canal. At the very end of the anus, there are two valves, two muscular valves or sphincters. There is an involuntary internal anal sphincter, and fortunately, there is a voluntary external anal sphincter. Let's review this. The internal anal sphincter is made up of visceral smooth muscle, and it is controlled or innervated by autonomic motor neurons that work automatically. Fortunately, we have an external anal sphincter made up of skeletal muscle, and skeletal muscle is controlled by, innervated by, somatic motor neurons, which are under voluntary control. So when you all of a sudden have the, the urge, I gotta go, that means that the internal one has already opened up. It's already opened. And the only thing where you're trying to make it to the bathroom in time without having an accident is the sheer willpower over the voluntary one. Because the internal involuntary is already opened. All right, so fortunately we've got this one, because once both open, it starts coming out. All right? Incidentally, we have this same arrangement not only at the anus, but we also have this same arrangement in terms of urine flow. So for both number 2 as well as number 1, we have, when you get that urge where you gotta go pee, that means the internal involuntary urethral sphincter that we'll get to later is already relaxed and opened up, but you are preventing an accident using the sheer willpower over your voluntary external. That takes us to J34, and on the bottom of J34, I mention on the bottom of J34 hemorrhoids. And hemorrhoids are really enlarged veins, enlarged blood vessels around the anus. And I'm not going to say anything more about them because we will talk about them more when we get to the circulatory system, because hemorrhoids are really a vascular problem, a problem with these veins or blood vessels that are enlarged or varicose around the anus. So we'll talk more about those when we get to the circulatory system. On J35, disorders associated with the large intestine or colon. So we'll speak briefly about these very exciting subjects of diarrhea and constipation. Now, they're really just the opposite of each other. You know, it's interesting. These, on the one hand, we're thinking, come on, what are you talking about this? On the other hand, everybody has had situations of both diarrhea or constipation. They are really common. And every drugstore has entire aisles of products for either diarrhea or constipation. Diarrhea is where there's increased peristaltic contractions. So for whatever reason, maybe because of a virus, bacterial infection, maybe something you ate, there's increased peristaltic contractions, or what we call cramps, and that's pushing the contents of the large intestine out. Since we know there's a lot of water stored in the large intestine, it's pushing all the food residues, the fecal matter, and also a lot of water out. So that's why when you have diarrhea, it's a loose, watery stool. So it's got a lot of water in it. Constipation is the exact opposite. For whatever reason, there is a decrease in peristaltic contractions. The fecal matter, the food residues, remain in the large intestine longer than normal, and so the water is absorbed, and the person, when they try to defecate, when they have a bowel movement, it's a hard, dry stool. So it seems to me that if somebody is constipated, and it's all hard and dry, the first thing to try before you go to anything, you know, any medication, is just try drinking more water. And that should, since a lot of the water ends up accumulating in the large intestine, because that's designed to store water, so that'll loosen it up down there and maybe help it come out. Another thing that people do is they can eat fruits or other foods high in fiber, in cellulose. And that helps it come out and loosen it up. And an example of a fruit high in fiber that everybody has heard of is prunes. Prunes, prune juice. Prunes are just dried plums. And, but there's apricots, peaches, all kinds of fruits that are high in fiber or cellulose that kind of loosen it up. If that's not sufficient to increase your fiber content, then you can take drugs called laxatives or cathartics, which basically stimulate increased peristaltic contractions to cause constipation. Now, I did mention irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. And what IBS is that this is where many people, at least some people, when they get test anxiety. And so when you have an exam, people just find that they got to go to the bathroom more. And actually, I think the more common is people have to go to the bathroom more frequently. They call that an irritable bowel syndrome. They may have diarrhea, although there are some people who actually get constipated, just the opposite. So how it manifests itself because of this anxiety can vary. But that's known as IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome. Your anxiety level can affect your gut, your bowel, your peristaltic contractions. We know how our emotions affect lots of things in terms of our internal organs of our body. Okay, ulcerative colitis. Now, ulcerative means sores. Colitis is inflammation of the colon, the large intestine. These sores and inflammation in the inner lining of the large intestine is because of an autoimmune disease. There's a lot of autoimmune diseases. We've previously spoken of rheumatoid arthritis, where the immune system attacks the synovial joints. In this case, the immune system, the white blood cells and antibodies, attack the inner lining of the large intestine. There is a similar autoimmune disease that attacks the small intestine. I won't ask you to know it, but you may have heard of it. It's called Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease is an autoimmune attack on the inner lining of the small intestine, but we'll ask you to know ulcerative colitis. The next thing we've listed is diverticulosis and diverticulitis. This is the formation of weak, of pouch-like weak spots in the intestinal wall. It's when there are, in the wall of the large intestine, bulging weak spots in the wall. We can see a picture of this on J36, the next page. If we look on the bottom middle right here, this is the large intestine. And you'll notice where there seems to be bulging weak spots in the wall of the large intestine. It's kind of protruding, sticking out. Now, why have these bulging weak spots occurred? I'll get to why they occurred, maybe at least one reason in a moment. But this condition is called diverticulosis, when somebody has this. Now, the fecal matter with bacteria in it can collect in these bulging weak spots, and these diverticuli can become infected because of bacteria multiplying right in this bulging weak spot, and that's called diverticulitis. Itis means it's infected, it's inflamed. So if you just have the bulging weak spots, but there's no inflammation or infection, that's called diverticulosis. If it's infected, it's called diverticulitis. Now, one of the reasons that's been postulated, hypothesized as to what might contribute to this happening is a deficiency of fiber in the diet. Not eating enough fiber, which we know is cellulose or roughage. Now, what are the foods that are highest in cellulose or roughage? It's found only in plant matter, so whole grains, vegetables, and fruits. And this is in order of the ones that have the most fiber to what has the least. So whole grains are really the best source of fiber. Now the question is, what's all this fiber about? Didn't we say that cellulose or fiber we can't even digest? So who the hell needs it? If we can't digest it, we can't absorb it, why would we need cellulose or fiber? So let me explain it this way. How do we keep our arm muscles big and strong? We exercise. We make them work. The more you make your arm muscles work, the bigger and stronger they get. Your intestinal tract is muscular. It's a muscular wall. We know that one of the layers of the alimentary canal is called the muscularis. It's visceral smooth muscle. Its job is to create peristaltic contractions that push the food through our alimentary canal. One of the main things that it's got to push is fiber, because we can't digest it. But if you don't eat any fiber, if you basically say, I'm not going to eat whole grains, not going to eat vegetables, not going to eat fruit, then you're not eating any cellulose, because there's no cellulose in anything from an animal. So therefore, your muscular wall of your intestine doesn't have to work as hard to push anything. You'd say, yeah, there you go. Now our body doesn't have to work hard. But in fact, it's making your body work that keeps it healthy and strong. Exercising your arm muscles keeps your arm muscles strong. Exercising your brain keeps your brain going. And having a diet where the intestinal tract, the muscular wall, has to push, makes it work and keeps the muscular wall of the intestine thick and strong. So it's been speculated that if you don't eat enough fiber, it starts to get the wall of the intestine becomes thin and weak. The muscles shrink, they atrophy, they become thinner and weaker, and that creates these diverticuli. I'm going to come back to this picture in just a moment, but let's go back to the previous page, J35. And on J35, cancer of the colon. And we wrote that colon cancer, or colorectal cancer, is the second most common cause of cancer death in the United States. Let me put it this way. The most common cancer is actually skin cancer. And skin cancer is mostly seen in fair-skinned people who have less melanin to shield them against harmful ultraviolet rays. Basically, the major cause of skin cancer is fair-skinned people going out and sunning themselves at the beach or at pools. You know, that's the major cause, living in Palm Springs. So they all have skin cancer. But most people don't die from skin cancer because you notice there's something that doesn't look right on your skin right away. You go to a dermatologist and they cut out where the skin cancer, either the pre-cancer or actual skin cancer is. The number one cause of cancer death is lung cancer. Lung cancer is the most common cancer that people die from. And of course, we know that the major cause of lung cancer is smoking. All right, so people who smoke are the most high risk of developing lung cancer, and you die from it. Because once your lungs are cancerous, you know how we've learned that usually you remove the cancerous organ? Well, you can't remove your lungs. Because you can't live without lungs. All right? And so if the lung cancer is in both lungs, it's over. It's over. So that's the number one cause of cancer death. The second cause of cancer death is colon cancer. Now, the leading cause of colon cancer is actually a genetic defect. It's actually, the major factor is a defect in what's called the p53 gene. And I'll just remind you, we'd actually mentioned it. I'm not asking you to really memorize the p53 gene, but we described it on page B13. We were learning about the human chromosomes. We know that each gene is an instruction for making a protein. And on autosome number 17 is a p53 gene. When somebody has a defect in that gene, that's the most common cause of why they'll develop colon cancer. It's not the only cause. This is known as an oncogene, and we talked about a cancer-causing gene. It has been speculated, though, that not only are there genetic factors, but what you eat may also be a factor. And many people have advocated, again, that you need to increase the amount of fiber in your diet to possibly reduce the risk of colon cancer. I'll have more to say about that fiber in just a moment. What do they do if somebody has colon cancer? Well, you can live without a colon, so they surgically remove the cancerous large intestine, but that creates a problem. Depending upon how much of the large intestine they had to remove, if they've removed almost all of it, you can't stretch the small intestine all the way to your anus. It can't be stretched that far. So what they do is they create a new opening in the lower abdomen, and that's called a colostomy. Stomy means an opening. This is an artificial anus in the lower abdominal wall. You can see a picture of this on the next page, J36. So on J36 on the lower right side, so here is the small intestine. They create a new opening in the lower abdominal wall because this small intestine cannot be stretched all the way to the anus. And so then the person wears what's called a colostomy bag under their clothes. And the fecal matter just comes right out of the opening in the lower abdominal wall and spills right into this colostomy bag. They have no control over it. There's no muscular valve there. And it is very difficult psychologically. And it does smell. It smells. If you've ever known somebody who's wears this, and it's very difficult. They don't go to the bathroom. It just flows in and they have to empty this bag. So it's very difficult to deal with psychologically having the large intestine removed. That's called a colostomy. I did want to mention one last thing about fiber or cellulose, and I want to tell you very briefly about seeds. And I know that's why you're taking this human anatomy class, is to learn about seeds. But I'm going to just tell you this because I find that most students don't know what I'm about to describe. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of seeds, but all seeds are the same. It doesn't matter whether we talk about a corn kernel, that's a seed, or a pea, or a lima bean, or a wheat seed, or a rice seed. They're all seeds. All nuts are seeds. So all seeds are pretty much the same. Let's focus on a wheat seed. So in a seed are three things. One of the things inside of a wheat seed is a baby plant, the embryo. And obviously a baby plant, because when you plant the seed in the soil, it grows into a plant. It's a baby plant. So it's got proteins and DNA and RNA. It's got nucleic acids and proteins in that baby plant. That's nice. Another thing that's in the seed is this outer skin made up of cellulose, of fiber. So the outer skin of a corn kernel, the outer skin of a lima bean, that's cellulose. And we may have mentioned this before. If you ever look at a kid who's eaten, let's say, raisins or corn, and when they go to the toilet, look in what it looks like. You'll see the outer skin of the corn and the raisins just in the feces, because you can't digest it, if anybody's ever noticed that. So that's the outer cellulose wall. And then what's in the middle is a bunch of starch, or amylose. Now the purpose of the starch is actually to provide sugars, because that starch is just broken apart into glucose, to provide the sugars for this baby plant to grow until it's got a shoot sticking up above the soil, and it can start carrying on photosynthesis with sunlight to make more food, to make more sugars. But when its seed is still under the ground, it can't do photosynthesis yet, so it's using the nourishment in the starch as a source of energy. Now, you can buy where they take wheat seeds and they crush them into flour. That's called whole wheat flour. Whole wheat, they use the whole wheat seed. And you can make heavy whole wheat bread. And whole wheat bread is considered pretty nutritious because it's got proteins and nucleic acids, it's got starch, and it's got cellulose or fiber. That's whole wheat bread. It's heavy. Heavy bread, pretty healthy. They also sell each of these three parts separately. You can go to the market and just buy the embryo plant of a wheat seed. Just the embryo of the wheat seed. When I mention this, people always say, I never heard of that. This is called wheat germ. And wheat germ is sold in the section where they have cereals. One of the brands, Kretschmer's, comes in a bottle. And it's actually considered quite healthy. I don't happen to like it, but a lot of people do. It's, again, very nutritious in that it's high in proteins, nucleic acids, and so on. The reason why it's called wheat germ is because it's the embryo that germinates or grows. That's the part of the seed that grows. Now, they also sell just the outer cellulose, of the wheat seed. And that when they sell that, that is called wheat bran. Wheat bran. So you've all heard of bran flakes, and bran flakes are an excellent source of fiber or cellulose. And if you've heard of raisin bran, so that's a very high and a good source of fiber, which we've suggested might reduce the risk of diverticulosis and maybe even colon cancer. And then they sell just the starch, just the pure starch, which after all is just eventually digested into a bunch of glucose sugar molecules. So that's all starch is sugar. You'd say, well, how do they sell that in the market? That's white flour. So when you buy that refined, bleached white flour, the argument against using white flour and eating white fluffy bread made up of white flour, refined bleached flour, is it's just pure carbs. It's pure sugar. It's just, even though bread doesn't taste like sugar, and I happen to love bread, but it's just digested into individual glucose molecules, and that's what you're absorbing into your bloodstream. So now you know what wheat germ is, you know what wheat germ is, you know what wheat bran is, and you know the difference between whole wheat flour and white flour.